The following is a presentation from the 8th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. Together apart, creating spaces for understanding and reimagining society. Due to the 2020 pandemic, all presentations were conducted through Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
I am Professor Liz Melanson, and I teach at Rockville in the art department. And we are so thrilled to have Dr. Sarah Beetham and artist Ada Pinkston here. Thank you so much for coming. Dr. Beetham is the chair of liberal arts and assistant professor of art history at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. She specializes in American art and particularly the monuments erected to citizen soldiers after the Civil War. Dr. Beetham holds an MA and PhD in art history from the University of Delaware and a BA in art history and English from Rutgers. Her current book project, Monumental Crisis, Accident, Vandalism, and the Civil War Citizen Soldier, considers the long history of damage and alteration of Civil War monuments in the context of the recent debate over Confederate memory. Dr. Beetham has published extensively in art history and pedagogy and has been interviewed regarding her work on Civil War monuments by the Washington Post, Associated Press, The Guardian, US News and World Report. And we are very lucky to have her today. She shared with us before this a talk titled Confederate Reckoning, Toppling Statues in the Summer of Iconoclasm, which I know everybody in my class got to see and hopefully some other people did too.
We're also very lucky to have Ada Pinkston here with us. Ada Pinkston is a multimedia artist, educator, and cultural organizer working in Baltimore, Maryland, where she is also a lecturer in art education at Towson University. She holds an MFA from MICA and a BA degree from Wesleyan University. Her work explores the intersection of imagined histories and socio-political realities on our bodies using performance, digital media, and mixed media sculptures and installations. Her work has been featured in the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building, the Walters Art Museum, the Peel Museum, Transmodern Performance Festival, ES1, the New Museum, Light City Baltimore, and the Streets of Berlin. She was an artist in residence at VisArts in Rockville in the spring of 2020 and is currently a fellow at the Philadelphia-based Public Art Studio Monument Lab. We look forward to hosting Professor Pinkston as an artist in residence at Montgomery College when we are back on campus. And Ada provided a talk for us as well, titled On the Aesthetics of Truth, Monuments, Memory, and Hegemony. And my students also were able to watch both of the talks, and we'll include links in the chat for anyone who hasn't had a chance to see them yet. That way you can, review the videos later on if you'd like to.
All right. So in their talks, Sarah and Ada both spoke about the power of monuments in public space. They reminded us that public monuments affect us emotionally as individuals and inform our collective psyche as a community. Ideally, monuments reflect a society's current values and needs, but often they do not. This is the case of Confederate Civil War monuments today. In the 5 years since the Charleston, South Carolina church massacre, and especially in the months since George Floyd's murder this May, Confederate monuments have faced renewed and more intense public scrutiny. As Ada argues, Confederate monuments describe and reinscribe patriarchy and white supremacy. Sarah showed that this had, in fact, always been the case with Confederate monuments in public spaces. She explained that these monuments were created not so much as memorials to fallen soldiers, but as declarations of the victory of white supremacy after Reconstruction. Sarah described monuments as living documents with shifting meanings. Throughout history, communities have had to reconsider and reckon with the meanings of their monuments, as we are doing now. Recognizing that Confederate monuments no longer reflect our values, we have to decide what to do with them. Sarah described efforts to move them to less public and ideologically fraught spaces, alter them, or recontextualize them. Though she highlighted some of the more successful recent attempts at these things, She offered a strong argument for allowing obsolete monuments like these to fade into oblivion entirely. Ada discussed her recent research and work in creating new monuments that reflect a more equitable view of history. She asked how the architecture and monuments that we interact with on a daily basis inscribe and describe oppressive forces like patriarchy and white supremacy. She offered a survey of monuments that depart from this tradition, highlighting conceptual and minimalist examples from the last century that inform her own work, disrupting the traditional concept and aesthetic of the monument to reflect a diversity of worldviews in public space. So Sarah and Ada, our first question for you is, what makes a sculpture a monument? And following up on that, are all monumental public sculptures considered monuments? And are all monuments site-specific by definition? So I guess we're looking for a definition of monuments currently.
I have a feeling Ada's thoughts are going to be maybe a little different than mine, because I think Ada might be seeing this from a more kind of contemporary perspective. But I would say historically, the idea of what a monument is that makes it different from a sculpture is that it would be a sculpture that is meant to commemorate someone or something, and that commemoration is celebratory in some way. So that's kind of making the difference between a monument versus a memorial, which would be more kind of based on mourning or kind of remembrance, not necessarily positive. A monument has kind of a more positive connotation. And kind of also taking from the 19th century perspective, I would say that the monuments, the idea of site specificity, I think is a bit more recent too. That if we're talking about these things that were put up in the 19th century, that first of all, many of them have been moved over and over and over again. A lot of them were put up at intersections and moved when it became obvious that that was a really poor idea, for instance. That many of them came out of catalogs, were kind of put together in a very generic way. And you don't really see artists starting to really collaborate with architects and really thinking about site towards it until like at least the last quarter of the 19th century.
I was going to say the beginning of the talk that you guys have, I went over a definition of monuments. And I think that at this moment, it's important to move past the object of the monument and think more about what exactly is the signifier of the monument, right? Because, so monuments can be a memorial, right? Monuments are an archive, essentially, right? So they are these objects that are signifiers, as they should be, right? They're signifiers of the past and the stories about the past, right? But they're also very much, how do we create a narrative about a particular past, right? So Sarah did a good job of explaining that most of the Confederate monuments were built way after the Civil War and at the height of Jim Crow, right? And the height of Jim Crow was when all of these laws were put into place to reinscribe white supremacy after the Civil War, right? And the laws of Jim Crow are, in 1964, they are, with the Civil Rights Act, they were kind of obliterated, but then there's always other different types of technologies that continue to create these circumstances of legalese, right? Like we can even look at the prison industrial complex as an example of that. So I think that, and back to the question of the definition of the monument, and over the past 50 years, right, we've been in this moment of reconsidering how do we reconcile with past histories of colonialism and fascism that need to be reconciled, right? So in the talk that I gave, I was also thinking about like other examples outside of the context of the US that we can look to that can help inform us around ways to reconsider all of it, right? So in Germany, there's a whole movement of artists after World War II that were dealing with how to reconcile Holocaust, how to reconcile the moment of the Holocaust. And so all of the monuments to Hitler and all these fascist figures are removed, right? But I think here, we're still talking about like so there's still this desire to hold on to this, the narrative of the lost cause, because white supremacy is still very much ever present in the present day. So, and there hasn't been any truth and reconciliation post Jim Crow, right? So I think that, you know, this conversation of removing the monuments, I think it should go further than that. And we should think about removing the Electoral College even, right? Because that's a monument that as well, I look at that as a monument. Personally, I'm more of a movement of thinking about memorials instead of monuments, right? Like, because this idea of a person on a horse on a pedestal, it doesn't really say much to me as an aesthetic form. It doesn't really move me as much as like Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. But I answered your question and beyond that, so I'll let you ask the next one.
Thank you for that, Ada. And, you know, for talking about that definition of monuments, as well as the survey that you provided on the aesthetics of monuments through history. So your talk was called On the Aesthetics of Truth, Monuments, Memory, and Hegemony. Can you explain to our students what you mean by hegemony?
So hegemony is basically systems of power, right? Like, what are the systems of power that are in place that keep people dispossessed and keep the narratives of people in power at the forefront or at the center of historical narratives, right? So we can say that, for instance, in the state of Texas, up until 2016, they were not even listing in K through 12 education textbooks, they weren't even talking about the transatlantic slave trade as an institution, and instead they were calling people that were enslaved workers. And so this silencing of historical moments that reinforce white supremacy and reinforce these systems of power is what I mean when I say hegemony, or hegemonic structures and systems. But I think also in terms of aesthetics, like, you know, these 19th century aesthetics that Sarah did a beautiful job describing, though that aesthetic also reinforces hegemony, because it's a figure on a horse that's looking down on everyone and isn't, you know, it's continuing this narrative of this great victor, or this person or this historical figure that is all encompassing in the creation of this country as it is today. But we know that not to be true, right? So yeah, that's what I mean by hegemony.
Thank you. And just a note, we are going to be taking questions from all of you at the end. So if you'd like, you can go ahead and start putting them in the chat, and we'll monitor that. And then you'll have time to ask your questions out loud too at the end. So Sarah, one of my classes had a really nice debate. And their debate was, some were asking, does removing the Confederate statues entirely or letting them deteriorate mean that we're attempting to erase this important history, or are we doomed to repeat history if we forget it? And then some were asking, is there any reason to save Confederate citizen soldier monuments, say in terms of artistic or material culture value? Yeah. And can the history of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction be effectively taught without centering and glorifying monuments dedicated to the villains of the story?
Sure. So those are a couple questions, and I will try to do my best to break them all down. So first of all, this issue of whether or not taking down statues erases history. I've been asked this question a lot, and the first thing that I think it's really important to understand is that monuments are not history. What you think about as a history textbook, a monument cannot do that. Just by nature, it can't. When you think about what public sculpture is, there are big, expensive works of art that are made out of either granite or bronze or marble or I guess the cheap ones are made out of zinc, so maybe those are a little less expensive. But for the most part, like the undertaking that is necessary to put up, say, a bronze statue that you commission an artist to do is enormous. It's something that requires a tremendous amount of funds. And as a result, the people who hold the money are the people who are going to decide what it is and what is going to be enshrined there. Their opinions are generally not going to be the same as everyone else's opinion. It tends to be more likely to be kind of a small c conservative kind of opinion. They're also, there's only so much you can say on a monument. You're not going to put huge lines of text most of the time. You're going to probably put the most celebratory version of something. So, for all these reasons, the kind of history that monuments are telling you just generally across the board can't trust it. It's not something that is going to tell you what actually happened. Second of all, the Confederate monuments in particular are erasing history. Those monuments are lying. They always were intended to lie. They are telling you something about the Civil War that isn't true. The Civil War was fought over slavery. All of those monuments claim it wasn't. And all of those monuments claim that white people are better than anybody else. And that is not true. So those monuments are erasing history. It's the biggest fake news campaign in the history of America. The very fact of the lost cause and the fact that some of us still believe it. So those monuments are the thing that's doing the erasing. So another way to think about this is, iconoclasm, the specific and on purpose destruction of art has happened pretty much as long as there has been art. There are so many examples of this throughout history. But just to give you one example, the Roman Empire was one society that routinely destroyed monuments. And it was because after an emperor that everybody particularly hated finally died or was no longer emperor, they would ritually destroy the monuments to that emperor. But we haven't forgotten about Nero. We haven't forgotten about Caligula. We haven't forgotten about Caracalla or Caracalla's brother Geta, who appears next to Caracalla, but with his face scratched out in so many images. We haven't forgotten about any of those people. And in some ways, the kind of smashed up monuments that still exist to them that we pull out of the ground make us more interested in learning about that history. So I don't think there's a real worry about losing or destroying history or not remembering the history because some of these monuments aren't going to be in public spaces anymore. On the question of material culture value, what I like to say is I am a person who, I don't remember how many years ago it was when I started my dissertation at this point, but I decided to work on clunky Civil War monuments that came out of catalogs on purpose because I really liked them. I found them really interesting and I found the way that they were propagated interesting. I wanted to learn about how this figure kind of became really important to America. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I don't really see the distinction of these ones should be saved because they're nice looking and these ones shouldn't be saved because they're crummy things that came out of catalogs. I think is the wrong kind of a distinction. If they are harming people, that's why they should come down. Whether they are really fancy statues that were made by French sculptors and then shipped over here, like the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, or whether they're the zinc monuments that came out of catalogs from Bridgeport, Connecticut. All of those statues are, espousing white supremacy. All of them should come down. The converse of that is that there's plenty of kind of mundane, crummy sculpture all over America that is not upsetting anyone, and that should stay. People could have their crummy statues if they want. So, as far as I'm concerned, the aesthetics isn't the problem. The harm that they're doing is the problem.
Thank you, Sarah. So this question is for Ada, and I'm gonna share a couple of images that sort of go along with this question. So Ada, in your opinion, what significance do monuments carry for their communities and public spaces? Why do people feel so strongly about monuments and sometimes resist new aesthetic approaches? Are we conditioned to expect monuments that are familiar or that support a certain narrative? And the examples that we were thinking of in this question were Fred Wilson's E Pluribus Unum, which was never built, as well as Rachel White Reed's house, and Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which were built but then taken down and destroyed?
I think honestly, it's kind of what Sarah just mentioned. Like we have been very much brainwashed to believe a lot of different things. One of them is how we interact with public space, right? Or the ways in which architecture should be or should look like. I mean, so specifically with Fred Wilson, so there's different reasons why each one of these pieces had such a public outcry, right? So with Fred Wilson's piece, I think it was a combination between not wanting to let go of the stories related to the past that has so much white supremacy imbibed within it, right? And this is a project that he worked on for at least 5 years. And then there was this conservative group of people that were really not interested in this new narrative that he was weaving around this figure, right? And that's why this sculpture was never installed. And then with the second one, with Rachel White-Reid, I actually compared that to the Maya Lin monument, because Maya Lin's monument, there's this whole movement of people that weren't interested in the Vietnam Memorial either, right? And it's because they were more interested in having a bronze figure, a series of bronze figures installed. They actually eventually had a compromise where, like, right across from the Vietnam Memorial, there was a, I think it's a series of 5 soldiers that are installed right next to it. But with Rachel White-Reid's house, I think I think that her work was just in terms of the aesthetic, it wasn't a white man on a horse, and it wasn't something on a plank, right? And I think that her work was more about thinking about the domestic space, which is more of an aesthetic that you would associate with women. And the movement of people that were against this particular work was a group of men that were really opposed to this work in general. And, so this is a monument to domestic space and to the work and labor that women do. And again, when we think about hegemony, it's whiteness. So this construction of whiteness is very much interrelated with masculine, with the power structures of male orders, right? And then the last one, the reason why this is different. So Richard Serra's Tilted Arc was made in 1981, and so this is in New York, right? And it's in an area of the financial district where, there's a lot of wealthy people or people that work in the finance industry. And I honestly think that the reason why that they weren't interested in having this work installed there was because they weren't involved in the process of choosing the artist, to be quite honest. But it was removed because these are people in power, because they had money to make it so that it was no longer there. So for each one of these, there's a different reason why they were removed. But I also think that there is overall a resistance to change that occurs for various reasons. And so in Rachel White-Reid's case, this was in the UK, right? So with Richard Serra and the Fred Moten piece, that was in the context of the US. But the second one was in the UK. And I think it's important to look at the cultural circumstances in each case as well, right? Because I often, like, when we think about the narrative of the Confederacy, or the narrative of monuments that we often tell ourselves, we think about it in relationship to the stories of the past, right? I'm gonna keep saying this again, right? But I think in the context of Germany, this is a different situation, because in Germany, there was truth and reconciliation, and there's a desire to never return to this era of fascism ever again, right? Whereas in the context of the US and the UK, there was never, this rise to power of fascism never reached to the point of what happened during the world wars. And for this reason, the educational systems are different, right? So in Germany, there's a whole, the pedagogy that people get taught from K through 12 is one that's all about unlearning a lot of this, unlearning and this movement away from focusing on fascist aesthetics. So it's like in the US, there's always this ebb and flow. There's like this, you know, the pendulum is constantly swinging back and forth. I hope that answered your question. But I think that we need to think about, we always need to think about the social political context of everything as it relates to this, to the aesthetics of truth or the aesthetics of Confederate monuments in the context of the US. We haven't had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at all. So it's kind of impossible for people's brains to wrap their minds around something different.
We wanted to know who were the stakeholders involved in erecting Civil War monuments in the South, so let's say Confederate monuments, in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how has that changed? Who are they today? Who are the stakeholders? And who weighs in on these conversations when it's time to reconsider Confederate monuments today?
For the Confederate monuments, particularly, the northern ones are a little bit different. They're kind of fairly straightforwardly coming from Union veteran organizations. But in the South, you have a couple of different kind of groups participating, and you know, the ones who are actually wanting these things to be built. One are Southern veterans organizations, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, things like that. But the really, really powerful ones are actually ladies associations, ladies memorial associations first, beginning like right after the war and going up until the 1890s. And then starting, I think in 1894 or 95, is when the founding of the United Daughters of the Confederacy happens. The women who are in the United Daughters of the Confederacy are the wives, daughters of elites. Not necessarily people who are descended from actual Confederate soldiers, not necessarily people who are related to rank and file Confederate soldiers, but people who are coming from the elite. And they are sponsoring the vast majority of statues that are being put up. They are holding, you know, various kinds of fundraisers, you know, all different sorts of things to raise the money, bring it together. And then they are contacting either northern monument firms or people overseas, especially in Italy, to have the monuments shipped and then put up in Confederate states. So that's really for the common soldier monuments. For a lot of the more like elite monuments, like say the ones that are in Charlottesville, the Lee and Jackson monuments in Charlottesville, sometimes you actually have a case where just one person, so in Charlottesville, it was this one guy named Paul McIntyre, decided that he thought that Charlottesville should have monuments. And so he laid out the tremendous amount of money all by himself and more or less, you know, claimed Charlottesville spaces by fiat, and had these monuments put up in places that had historically belonged to Black Charlottesvillians. You actually have like some kind of complicated legal things going on here, which is that in a lot of cases, the daughters would give the monument or would pay for the monument. The town would give the land, but the daughters would still own the monument. And that's still kind of the case today. There was a case in Reidsville, North Carolina in 2011 where a statue was knocked over by a minivan. When they went back and looked into town records, they discovered that the town owned the land, but the daughters owned the statue. So the town was like, well, you can't have the land anymore. And they commissioned a new statue, but put it up in a cemetery. So there's all those kind of complicated things going on from the 19th century. So you've got the daughters, you've got men's veterans groups, but you've got, you know, people like Paul McIntyre who are just paying for these things by themselves. I would say today, you've got a lot more kind of groups working on things. The big question, I think, that has been going on for the past 5 years, that has sort of been answered, I think, by what happened in June, was who was going to be in charge of deciding what happens to these monuments. Are the states going to be in charge, or are the cities going to be in charge? Because what was happening, especially after 2015, when this whole thing started with the church shooting in Charleston, was that immediately Republican state legislatures passed a whole bunch of laws to try to protect monuments at the state level and prevent any local citizens from doing anything about them. At the same time, you have cities that are trying to rush kind of against time to start to bring monuments down. And the fight has been going back and forth over the past 5 years over, who gets to decide. Does the city decide? Does the state decide? There have been a number of legal challenges. Charlottesville is one of them that was on its way, through the courts. There was another one going on in Birmingham that was on its way through the courts. Virginia, of course, repealed its monument law as soon as there was a Democratic legislature. But that fight has been going on. What I think has happened since June is that cities all across the South have decided that they don't care what the state laws are, that they are willing to pay whatever the penalties are. In Alabama, for instance, it's a $25,000 fine for removing a monument, and the cities have decided they're going to take that on and pay the $25,000 fine in order to take these monuments down and keep their citizens safe. There's really definitely a really complicated web of people who are deciding, in addition to the fact that sort of local citizens are on both sides of the issue arguing about it as well.
I also want to reiterate something that I mentioned in the talk that most of you guys didn't see, but at this point there's about 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy in public spaces throughout the United States. Right. And that to me is absolutely ridiculous, considering that the Confederate cause did not win. But as Sarah stated, the cause of white supremacy maintained itself. Right. So if we look at this map of all of the Confederate monuments that have been installed since the end of the Civil War, we see the height of it was in between 1900 and 1960. Which again was at the height of Jim Crow. And then from 1960 to 2000, these monuments were still being erected. And also I want to point out the fact it's not just in the South, there's different parts of the United States where these Confederate legacies are upheld in various ways, and they're upheld through, as Sarah stated, through private funders. I also want to iterate, I didn't mention this in the talk that I gave you, but I want to say it, that Robert E. Lee was not interested in maintaining division in the country at the end of the Civil War. And I think that is really important to think about. Neither was Jefferson Davis, who wasn't interested in keeping this division. So I think that when people say, I want to keep, I think that removing the monuments are removing history. Like, this is another example, in addition to what Sarah said, right? Like, this is another example of a fact that was stated by both of these Confederate war soldiers that are oftentimes uplifted in these monuments that the Confederate daughters built years after the war.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about your own work. So I'll just share some of the images that we have. So in your talk, you mentioned that your recent projects, including Resonance, Every Time We Say Your Name, It Is a Prayer, Pipelines, and Landmarked, include elements of performance, some of which you describe as rituals. Could you tell us a little bit about the performances and the role that performance plays in your concept of a monument?
Basically, I really do see it as a ritual. And also when you think about monuments, it's like it requires so many resources to install, right? It requires so many, yeah, it really does, to install and also to maintain. So performance and also digital media is a way to kind of get around the barriers of these permanent installations and tell stories that are counter narratives to the ones that most architectural public space tells about the past. So for every time we say your name is a prayer, it was a series, it was a poetry reading with Rooted Collective. So there was Saida did a reading. And Rooted Collective is a group of queer people of color in Baltimore that there's parties, but then there's also ceremonies that are held. And then on the side of that plinth was a series of projections that went through to the night. And these are quotes by different historical figures in African-American and indigenous histories, and then also contemporary writers and poets.
Thank you, Ada. As a follow-up to that question, could I ask a little bit about how your process of doing research on the aesthetics of monuments, how that informs the work that you're doing? This is something that might be really interesting to our art students, the role of research in your own creative content.
Yeah, honestly, research is so important because it's like, how does my work speak to and respond to the time, but also how does my work speak to and respond to other artists, right? And so a lot of my research is about how do I, what are the aesthetics of truth? How do we break the barriers of these stories that we have been told about ourselves, the stories that we have been told about other people? How do we break through those barriers and create new stories? So research it happens through reading, through, going through the archives of libraries, but also through conversations, right? So, and also listening and reading through news, right? What's happening in the moment? How do we make the work reflect the times, right? That's what Nina Simone said, right? That's what the role of the artist is, to reflect the times, right? And you gotta do the research to get to that reflection. With pipelines, you mentioned pipelines. I was waiting for that image to pop up, but it didn't. With pipelines, that was a collaborative project with Luminous Intervention. And that was a monument for people that have died from state-sanctioned violence, right? So that was made after the uprisings that happened in 2015, after Freddie Gray was murdered. So it was a collaboration with 4 other artists in Baltimore, and there's another artist in Oakland, Ori Original. But it was a projection on a piece of architecture that was actually slated to be demolished because, again, the power structures that weren't interested in the person that is over the architecture in downtown Baltimore isn't really interested in brutalism anymore. So they're basically taking down all of the brutalist sculptures. But also this site was where the Occupy Wall Street movement was centered in 2011. So it's this site is a very loaded site for obvious reasons. It's also a site where a lot of people that are without homes stay or stayed, right? Because now it's a different site, right? Because all of these structures have been removed. Yeah, so that installation was also a place where there was a conversation, a community conversation about ways to reimagine what does safety look like outside of the context of the prison industrial complex, which I think is really important to note, because when we think about the end of the institution of slavery, the beginning of the institution of prisons started, right? So so I think that you know, it's important to think about, because these stories of the past don't exist in a vacuum. It's important to recontextualize the stories of the past to make us see the realities of our present. And then what was the other one that you asked me about? Oh, the performance. So yeah, so that was literally, I have a background as a dancer. I did West African dance for many years, and that is why this piece was literally, it was done after the 4 Confederate monuments were removed in Baltimore City in 2018. And it basically was about like, what does it look like to embody some of the women, or specifically the African-American woman, whose stories are not in the textbooks, whose stories are not told in the K through 12 education that most people get. So that's why that performance happened. And also, you know, like outside of the people, you know, who we know about, like Fannie Lou Hamer, Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman, who were the other women that came from this period in the 19th century. So
we would like to open it up to all of your questions. So if you want to put them in the chat while I ask this question. Sarah, you talked about these Civil War monuments that were actually ordered out of catalogs and were at times kind of identical to the ones that were going in the North. And Ada talked about artist will a lot in her talk. So we wanted to ask, how is meaning created if the sculptures are generic, if there is no real artist will? How is meaning projected onto a monument, whether it's a Confederate monument or, you know, any public object?
So yeah, there's a couple of assessments. It is true that in a lot of cases, like trying to find the actual artists for these things is really difficult. I do know some names of them because I've been spending a lot of time on this, but they're not big names. And you kind of have to hunt for them, especially for the Confederate monuments. A lot of times those ladies' memorial associations will on purpose refuse to mention where they got the statue from in any newspaper articles or anything, because they're not going to say that they got it from Connecticut. Or they'll say they bought it from an Italian or something like that. So the actual makers of these things are kind of invisible in a lot of ways. But what I would say is that there's something about the sameness of them that communicates very loudly as a group. That it's this kind of tension between the local and the national that really happens with these statues. So, you know, I'll take it from like a northern context, just a second. A lot of those statues that were first put up in the North were put up right after the war, were put up in cemeteries, and were actually inscribed with the names of all of the people from that particular town who had died in the war. So, you know, we think of Maya Lin's monument as being so different from previous ones, but in that one respect, she's actually very similar in that this idea of naming everyone kind of was happening during the Civil War. So if you go to any small town where those very early monuments are put up, you have the very local experience of seeing the names of the people from that town. But on the other hand, you have the fact that that town is connected with the next town, is connected with the next town, is connected with the next town, is connected with the next town. And each one of those monuments represents so many deaths. And then, you know, you can really feel the enormity of what the entire war was when you see all of these statues together all across the space. The same thing like with the Confederate statues, you know, even if there isn't one particular artist who is communicating here, the fact that all of these statues, every single county has a county seat, every county seat has a county courthouse, every courthouse has a courthouse lawn, and on every courthouse lawn there's a Confederate statue. All of those guys marching together in front of all of those courthouses speaks very, very loudly. And shows that all of these spaces are being claimed for white supremacy. And there's something about that kind of collective power of them that makes the whole thing even more difficult. And then the one last thing I would say is that they're also communicating in language that was also thunderingly clear to people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and probably still is to us, even if we don't think about it too hard, which is that all of those monument forms, the equestrian statue, the column, the arch, all of these things are Roman triumphal forms that were, originated, well, not originated necessarily, but used by Roman emperors to talk about their own conquests and their own victories. And so that same language, which was so familiar to everyone in the 19th century in America, because so much of American aesthetics were built on that language, that those quotations really spoke very loudly as well.
Thank you. So we do have some questions in the chat that we can go to. Terry has a question for Ada. He says, what are the advantages and disadvantages of your monuments, which necessarily do not last long?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the advantages is that I don't have to go through the same type of process as Fred Wilson went through, where he labored for so many years and then found out that the monument couldn't be erected. A disadvantage is that it doesn't last, but I have the archive myself, right? So I keep it in my own archive, and that's a good thing, right? Because we have the power of creating our own archives through technology. It's that doesn't make it necessarily a disadvantage, but it does become a disadvantage in terms of like my overall vision of trying to create a space for counter narratives that is disseminated in the same ways that these narratives of white supremacy have maintained themselves, right? So it's a combination of both. And also, Sarah, I think it's interesting when you mentioned you're like talking about the naming, right? The naming of everyone that died, right? I think that died in the war. I think honestly, a lot of the stuff that Maya Lin came up against was also there was an undertoning of racism, because, when you think about who has the power to intervene in public space, we think about architects, and most architects are white and male, right?
Ada, as a follow-up to what you were talking about your work being, disadvantages and advantages of having it last not a very long time. One concept that you talked about in your talk was artist will. And you've also shared work that included audience participation, including your own plans for project Empty Pedestals, which will be crowdsourced. So how do you balance this idea of the artist's will driving the project and this idea of trying to incorporate more voices?
I think honestly, the art, like for me as a socially engaged artist, like I provide like the bowl, if you will, or the holding space for multiple voices to exist, right? So it's like that bowl is the artist's will, and then what goes inside of it is other voices. And then there's some element of curation that will happen with Empty Pedestals, because one of the things that I've been coming up against in some of my research is the ways that digital media or augmented reality or artificial intelligence can also reinscribe white supremacy in very strange ways. So I don't know if you guys heard about the example of the robot that traveled around the world. There's this robot that traveled around the world, and the people that designed the robot wanted it to like go to every single country, right? And when it came back, it was, or depending on the country, like it moved fine, moved through the world fine, but some countries, the robot was defaced. All of these slurs were drawn all over it. And, but I say that to say this is an example of how sometimes audience participation can go bad. So therefore there's a need for curation that is, and that curation is another part of the bowl or of the structure around it.
I might just say too that that the idea of audience kind of having a role, I think, is one of the things that differentiates public sculpture from any other kind of art. That, you know, nobody's going to come into my house and tell me what paintings I'm allowed to put up on my wall, hopefully. But public space is something that does belong to everyone, that everyone has to deal with. And then I think one of the things that we're seeing happening so powerfully with all the monuments that are being taken down is that people are saying, I don't want this in my public space anymore. We have to get rid of it. It has been oppressing us for way too long. I think that, you know, probably one of the trends we're going to be seeing is that communities are going to want to have more and more of a voice in deciding what their public spaces are, how they're going to be used, and how it's going to be representing them.
It was just announced that the Mellon Foundation is investing $250 million in what they're calling the Monuments Project. And Ada, the Monument Lab, it looks like, is getting the first grant from the Mellon Foundation, and you're a fellow there, right? So I guess the project is to work with communities around the country to reimagine public spaces through participatory actions. And you were telling us about some of the things that you've been seeing. So performance, collaboration, crowdsourcing. And I wanted to ask both of you, what do you see? What are you kind of thinking might be some more trends in creating new monuments as we go forward?
I think what the Monument Lab has been doing for the past couple of years has been really amazing. And I think, you know, if you go to that website, you'll see a lot of other artists that are part of the fellowship program that they've started 3 years ago. But then also before the fellowship program, they had a series of artists that they worked with in Philadelphia to do some site-specific installations, but then also some work that was more responsive to the current presence of the city, the current political presence of the city. But yeah, so the future of monuments looks less male. It looks more, it's more robust. The stories of future monuments are more robust and tell the stories of the past, but then connect them to the present. And there's a lot of futurism that I've been seeing in new monuments, right? Like this idea of like what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, just use of technology in general is what I've been seeing.
I'll say that I no longer trust my prognostication skills because a week before the protest started this summer, I was giving a talk to a group of graduate students, and I said, you know, with the pandemic, I think it's unlikely I'm going to see any Confederate monuments come down, so I'm going to have a quiet summer. So that didn't happen. So I no longer trust my ability to predict the future. But I would say that there's a couple of things that go in different directions that I'm going to be watching for. One of them is that I think we can't count figuration out yet. That, you know, people are always going to want their statues. And that it's something that a lot of people I've talked to who work on contemporary stuff are really, you know, wondering about all the time, like, why do cities still just want to put up statues? But I think that that's still going to be something that we see. But kind of going in the opposite direction, a trend that I've been seeing among a lot of people who work on monuments and memorials and who think about them is the idea of, like, you know, are monuments effective, or are they a failure? You know, is this moment that we're seeing right now where, you know, we're throwing all these obsolete monuments out the window, is that a sign that we shouldn't be doing this anymore? So the other trend I'm going to be looking for is kind of maybe more of what Ada's work is talking about, this idea of impermanence, things that are meant to have a shelf life, things that are not going to be there forever. You know, things that you can, you know, when that moment of significance has passed, that you can replace them with something else. And also, you know, thinking about the continued degradation of our planet, you know, what is the environmental impact as well as everything we're doing.